Boom and real life. That's how you
Hello,
start a
everybody.
podcast.
Stop cutting me off, man.
That's how you start a podcast, the Joe Rogan style.
Keep this about a fist from your face.
All right, so what do we have today? What are we talking about?
So we thought of what better way to start a podcast than talking about podcasts. And it's funny, everybody's doing it. We're doing it as we speak about it. So let's just talk about podcasts, man.
Yeah, it's quite meta, a podcast talking about podcasts.
Right,
So
that's exactly.
yeah, so okay, let's talk about podcast then. So the podcast is a quite, I mean, relatively new kind of a format that's been out there. When you compare it with the history of television or radio or other forms of media, I think podcast is relatively very new, and it's still not taken off. It's still not reached its potential of reaching out to a lot of people out there.
Yeah, certainly not in India. I mean, like if you just look at any sort of data set, right? Like I've got one here. We'll mention it in the show notes because we can say that now because we have show notes. The 2020 estimated global revenue for podcasts, the podcasting industry, according to PwC, is $103 billion. Right, that's with a B, dollars, not in rupees. And the Indian market, the Indian podcast market, is worth 0.9 billion. Right, so that's 900 million. But if you look at I mean, we're obviously from India, and we're going to talk about it with our context, right? So, in terms of the Indian context, and you can pick up after I just finish this small point, is the Indian context, the market's going to grow from 0.9 billion to 1.7 billion. So that's almost double, right, by 2024, according to PwC. And the global market is going to grow from 103 to 120. So obviously, India is going to have a much larger jump. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's great. And if anybody is looking into, getting into this field or this format, I think this would be the right time, like what we are doing right now. We actually watch the market, we analyze it for years, and now we are finally entering it. Of course not. We
I
just
watch the market. He means that we listen to podcasts when we have the time, which is basically all the time because we're at home right now.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, on a serious note, it is a great time to get into this format, because recently I think even in India, Spotify and all these big players like Amazon, with their app Audible, I think they have a whole separate wing for podcasts, Audible Suno, and Spotify also recently had their first ever podcasting conference or fest. I think it was called Podcasting Fest, where India's biggest uh, podcasters were on it, giving.
Really?
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
one platform for everybody?
No, I'm talking about they had a, how, I think I'm forgetting the exact name, but it's kind of a fest, like a 1 day or a 2 day thing. It was on a weekend. It was all online. India's biggest podcasters, they all featured. They gave a talk. I think even Amit Verma, Ranveer, and all those people, they gave talks on various things on how they started their journey and everything. I think Spotify did that this year, especially because it has seen incredible growth this year given the pandemic and lockdowns, and it was a very apt time to do such a thing. and it just shows how much of a uh, how much of a platform it has grown into already, despite not reaching its fullest potential yet. So that's great, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
huge for the
and
Indian podcasting industry.
one thing, if you look at the most popular shows on most popular podcasts in India, I'm looking at Spotify right now. One thing that you'll notice is Joe Rogan is everywhere. He's on the top charts in India, in every other country, and obviously worldwide. He's on the top charts. But especially when you look at the Indian charts, what you realize in contrast to other markets, or sorry, other countries, is that the it's see, I see Geeta daily. I see Geeta all about I see a lot about motivational things like Jay Shetty show, the Ranveer show. So most of these top charts podcasts, it's mainly about people improving themselves, and
Right.
that's a great sign for India, don't you think so?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a layer of improvement for everybody. And I just pulled up the chart as well. Uh, yeah, everything is either spiritual, uh, motivational, or general, right? So the general ones would probably be Joe Rogan, uh, and the Ranveer show, Beer Biceps. And
Mm.
everything else is fairly either spiritual, devotional. Some of them are FM radio based, but there are very few that are based on, say, information, right? And I think that's the main pull of podcast, because right now you can sort of read up about anything, and instead of that you can listen up to anything, right? So if you have a particular topic in mind, you can just sort of deep dive into the entire thing through a podcast to supplement your reading or to replace your reading, right? That's fairly easy right now. And what because there's so much information and all these things, we thought we would just sort of put that all into a podcast in one episode. uh, and yeah, and this one is an attempt to put it in and talk about the podcasting scene itself,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, yeah. So like one observation that we made right now is that most of the shows that are popular in India either have a spiritual tone to it or a motivational tone, which is
Right.
great. It shows that people are seeking to improve themselves, and that's a great sign for our country. Another thing that came to my attention while I was looking at stuff for this podcast is that most of the podcasts, at least that you and I listen to, or the people that we know listen to, like the Seen and the Unseen by Amit Verma, even the Joe Rogan podcast and Tim Ferriss podcast, all these popular podcasts. One thing that you notice is that all of their episodes, their average runtime is about 2 hours, 2 or 2.5 hours. Yeah, and
Right.
one global trend that we are noticing recently is that the attention span of people, it's dropping ridiculously, right? And it's sort of a contrast when the attention span is dropping so low, and these podcasts have so many millions of downloads. What do you think about that contrast? It's quite weird, right?
Yeah, I think that right now we've seen probably a divide where you have on one side the long forms, which is both in editorial as well as right now in podcasts, right? You have the long forms in terms of, in India you would have like these 2.5 hour shows, like the Ranveer show is like 2.5 hours. The Seen and the Unseen is, there are episodes that go on for 5 hours, you were telling me the other day.
Mm,
uh, and obviously those can be broken down into clips, and you can sort of rehash it in a YouTube channel. People do that, right? And on the other end, on the other extreme end, you have these short podcasts which encapsulate a particular topic. It will be really really like topical with a short lifespan, right? Like for example, something that happened in the news today, something that happened in the economy today, or something that happened in pop culture today, or something that happened in sports today, like a particular match or something, right?
mm,
um, and and they'll sort of put it all into a 7-minute segment or a 15-minute segment, and they'll put it out, and that gets a lot of listeners as well because it's topical, but it can't be revisited. Like there've been multiple times where I have gone back to an old Joe Rogan podcast or a Tim Ferriss podcast and gone through it. I mean, the entire 2.5 hours, and I've done it multiple times for multiple people, multiple guests on the show.
I'm pretty sure
And
it's
what this
mostly
is,
for David Goggins, right?
yeah, it's mostly for David Goggins, the Naval Ravikant episode.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh
there's
man,
so
that
many, man.
episode
That Pat
I
McKenna.
went.
Oh,
Yeah,
like
that episode I
there's
went
like
back
some
to.
guy has written these crisp notes on those YouTube videos, and how imagine how much time he would have spent on. It's like a 2 hour, 11-minute podcast. Probably spent close to like 12 hours on that making those notes, but they were very helpful. Whoever you are, thank you very much.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's it's just been divided into the short ones, which includes the clips of the long ones. And
Mhm.
on the other end, you have the long ones, which have had their devoted set of followers, which are represented in the numbers, the downloads, and the subscriber count, right? So I think in the middle, you will have like this sort of gray area where it's neither here or there. You have like a bunch of people who are not doing 45-minute long podcasts. Right? Nobody does that because it's too long for a commute, and it's too short for a long drive, right? Or it's too short to be broken up into three segments. Like you can't have a 17-minute segment listen three times, right? 15-minute
Mhm.
segment listen three times. You either have to have the entire thing 2 hour broken up into half an hour each, or you need to have a 7-minute thing digested very quickly during a walk or a break or a commute, but not the 45-minute long. So I mean, that's one fairly one thing that I've sort of seen with the podcast, both Indian as well as foreign.
Yeah. See, another thing is that what that trend that I just told you about, that, when the attention spans are dropping so low and these downloads for these big, I mean, long podcasts are increasing every day. What I think is that people are really craving for quality content, and
Right,
it's not available to them. When you look at, when you want to, understand the news or what's going on in the world, you turn on television, Republic TV, or all those channels. You really don't get anything but sound bites, right?
right,
And people often, even podcasts are sort of, funded by different organizations and everything. But one thing about podcasts is that when you're talking, I think, referring to the tweet that Balaji Srinivasan put out today, that, podcast is peer to peer. You're talking directly to that person, and you sort of can't, you're not trying to sort of disprove whatever the person is saying. It's like a consensual conversation that you're having, and that is what I think will take us forward from wherever we are in the world right now, with the conflicts going on everywhere in the world. And remember when during the presidential elections in the US, Joe Rogan suggested that he is willing to host a 3 to 4 hour presidential debate between Trump and Biden. Imagine if
that
that
would
would
have
happen.
been, yeah, I mean, I don't think any of those 70-year-olds could last a 3 hour podcast sitting in
That's true.
that probably smoke infested room. But that would be something that would probably drive a presidential debate viewership more than a live debate on whatever channel that they had it on, right? Because like the thing is, if you have it on a channel, right, like on a broadcast media channel, you have to have all of these infrastructure points to drive your content, right? So the content that they're craving is um, politician talks about election, right? So that's the exact sort of uh, encapsulation of that 30-minute or 20-minute segment. But that has to have a lot of infrastructure points where you need sponsors, you need cable TVs disseminated across the country and across the world, you need internet connections, which is now a prerequisite everywhere, right? It's so cheap, especially in India. um, and you need all these things in order to show what content that you have. um, with podcasts, right, you don't need all of that. You don't need you don't really need a video. You can just have an audio. Some people have that because some people have the capabilities, like Joe Rogan has that, but it's purely like live, right? So it's not edited or it's not cropped out. It's just put, whatever is said is automatically put. So the infrastructure that a podcast has is very, very low. You need a phone with an internet connection. A phone is fairly cheap now, at least a phone that can handle a simple audio playing mechanism is fairly cheap now. And an internet connection also is fairly cheap now. If not, you just go to your go to get a free Wi-Fi, download the entire podcast, and listen to it for hours. Right? It beats listening to one song on loop 50 times. Right? Because like we've had that uh, teenagehood where we would um, download a bunch of songs off LimeWire or EMP3 or BMP3 or something like that and play it offline and thought that, oh, this is so cool, right? So because that was the only infrastructure that was there, and we used to listen to sort of one song on repeat. But now, because the infrastructure is there to listen to a podcast for a number of times, or download it and listen to it without the internet, or with any sort of low infrastructure, it sort of increases the quality. It decreases the stakeholders, and it decreases the infrastructure points that you need. So that has also sort of driven the adoption of podcasts throughout the world, at least from an organic level.
Hmm. Yeah, and even the distribution of the content that you record or you create, it's so cheap that it feels like it's free, and that is the most, I think, exciting part of internet. People leveraging their skills uh, on these various platforms, and podcast is definitely one of those platforms where people are embracing it, especially the creators, and
Right.
even YouTube has become a podcasting uh, space, surprisingly. I mean, I'm pretty sure it wasn't meant for that, but even audio podcasts where it's just a YouTube video of people talking without any, images or that video of them. People listen to that. They have a lot of those podcasts have millions of views, and it shows how the distribution is so cheap. Uploading things on YouTube is it's free, and right now Spotify have their Anchor, bought out Anchor, the company that allows you to record podcasts and distribute it for free, and even distribute it on various platforms, not just on Spotify, but Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and so many different things. I don't even know how many are there anymore. So that distribution has led to people creating uh, so many of these podcasts. But now I think uh, it begs the question: what about the flood of content out there? Already, we're seeing that with YouTube. There's so much content, and most of it is junk. And podcasts, set out to be for these people who are carving out like niche kind of content and all those things. And now we are seeing corporate podcasts and politicians starting their own thing, like making it like television. So that trend is also, I mean, it's something that I'm not looking forward to, but it is happening, right? And do you think that that will also cause people from looking for another format, or do you think they will just wither away with time?
I think it'll create niches, and then you will have to differentiate your niche, which will be a very hard thing to do, right? But you will drive the following of your niche to your niche. And like, just think about it this way: there's very little cost to join a subscriber. Sorry, there's very little cost to become a subscriber to a YouTube channel,
Hmm.
because it's just go to the particular website and click, right? What you're paying is obviously the time you spend on watching a video, time you spend, the physical action of liking and subscribing. Similarly for podcasts, what you pay to them, or the opportunity cost is you spending time putting on your earphones. And because it's become almost second nature to um, sort of put on your headphones when you are doing something that doesn't require you to have a lot of intuition, right? Like if I go into the kitchen and I'm like cleaning some dishes, I can very simply put on some headphones and listen to a podcast. You can't do that with a video. You can't watch the match and clean your dishes, or do anything that requires intuition. um, because of that, I think that it's podcasts are spreading more easily, because again, you don't need much to listen to it, and you can do it when you're doing anything. And because of that, I think that has given an incentive to a lot of these creators, whether they had platforms in media or content distribution or whatever, or they created platforms specifically in podcasts, where it was just completely new to them and they started up ground up from zero. uh, that has allowed them to sort of create a base very easily. I mean, it wasn't easy, obviously, but the process was easier than they probably saw before.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. And so I think we've talked a lot about the present state of this format, and I think the history is it's not that relevant. Like how it was actually invented on the RSS feed and everything. But when you look at the journey of, let's say, a person like Joe Rogan, who's been doing this for 10 years now, and how he's made a career out of it, like he signed a deal with Spotify for more than $100 million. That's a lot of money. I don't think any TV or you know TV or any of these legacy media people would have received such a huge amount of money for just talking. But
Yeah, I
he
mean,
he
and
has
he
done.
doesn't like, he just talks to people, and that's it. He doesn't like, it's great what he does, and I absolutely love his show. But think about the simplicity of what he does. He just calls people, most of whom are his friends, and he just tells them that, hey, listen, let's talk about something that you're interested in, which I'm curious about, for 2 hours or 6 hours, right? And let's just put it on the internet and let's see where it goes.
Yeah,
And
that's
look
so
where it's gone.
crazy. That's so crazy. I mean, like for this podcast that we're recording right now, all the preparation that took, it seems so much, but he does it so effortlessly, Joe Rogan. And I definitely think he's one of the guy who brought podcast to where it is, like one of the many people, obviously. But I think I would say that he is the biggest guy when it comes to like people for podcasts. And I don't think he's going to stop anytime soon. Like he recently had his 10th year anniversary of the Joe Rogan Experience. I think he's going to go on for 10 more years, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, like he'll be smoking joints in his 80s, listening and recording a podcast with what's his name, Alex Jones, and yeah, people still be listening to it because it's just so. I mean, it's not just entertaining; it's informative. I mean, I've discovered so many people on his show, and I never knew who they were until they came on, right? So
Mhm.
it's just a great platform to not just. And he's a shining example. It's not just to um, talk about something informative, but to build something that can sustain for a very long time if you do it continuously, and just shows that if you can have genuine conversations with interesting people, even if it, if you don't have a big base at first, that can be something that people listen to.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. And like his episode with Naval Ravikant, that man, it's the most, like the quality kind of it has the highest quality in any podcast that I've listened to. The amount of gems that you get out of that episode, it's just incredible. And I've recommended it to so many people. And like if when people ask me like what podcast to start off with, like whose episode, like which podcast, I just send them that link. Start off with this. Even if you're not a tech guy, or a person who, even if you don't know who Joe Rogan or Naval Ravikant is, that's the episode I send out because it's just brilliant. that episode. So, I mean, if people who are listening, if you haven't listened to that, stop listening to our podcast and go listen to that. Then come back to our
And on the
podcast.
other side, right, like think about it this way. um, David Goggins, who we both follow quite closely, the
Mhm.
first I heard of him was on the Impact Theory podcast. um,
Mhm.
and that was, I mean, like, he was just like, before he went sort of everywhere with the motivational videos and stuff, right? Like on YouTube, where people just clip his videos and put it on in 3 minutes or something. That was that 50-minute podcast on Impact Theory. And my God, was that good. And then he went on Joe Rogan twice. And since
Mhm.
then, he's sort of launched a book, which went, what, number one, number two on Amazon. Um, he launched a clothing brand, and he used to do these races before, but then he's got a lot of notoriety for doing these races after he went on the Joe Rogan Experience. But and the amount of people that have not just discovered him but used what he has said, like they do for Naval and productivity and tech and the way you think about complex things, right? You do it with simple grinding and physical effort. After listening to the David Goggins podcast. And I just would like to second what you said. And if you haven't heard that, both of those episodes, you should definitely stop listening to our podcast, because what we can give you and what that podcast can give you is worlds apart.
Yeah.
So yeah,
A- And
definitely check that out.
and you brought out a great point. The amount of people that we have discovered through podcasts or through these various podcasts, it's incredible, and it also shows that when a person or a brand, when they're trying to promote something like a book or something, their usual sort of way was to go on these TV interviews. They give you like what 3-5 minute slot. You talk about it in a quick soundbite, and you get out of there and hope that things work. But now people don't want that. They want to be on Joe Rogan. They want to be
Yeah, I
on
want to know
Tim
who the guy
Ferriss.
is, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I give you that example, right? We have, I mean, you've read that book, Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker, right?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
guarantee you wouldn't have read that book. I haven't read that book, so I'm just using your example. I guarantee you wouldn't have read that book uh, if you hadn't listened to him on that 2 hour or 3 hour podcast. Or this year there was a book called Breathe that came out, right?
Yes,
Jamie
exactly.
Nestor, by
Hmm.
the journalist Jamie Nestor. I might be getting his name wrong, but
James
something of
Nestor.
that along those. James Nestor,
Yeah.
right? His book probably, and again, this is a probable theory, that not a lot of people would have read that his book and got the insight. So I'll give you an example, right? One of the things that James Nestor said was, you should when you sleep, you should ideally like take a little bit of sellotape and put it on your lips, clasp your upper and your lower lip, so that you breathe through your nose when you sleep, and you can make that a habit, and it'll help you in other things. For instance, if you're running, you breathe through your nose, it's better for you. It'll prevent you from snoring, it'll prevent you from doing all sorts of things, right? Because we're obviously taught since we were kids, breathe through your nose, not through your mouth. And that sort of reinforces that. 7 hours to 8 hours in the night when you're asleep, that's a simple thing that you can do. I heard it on the podcast. I haven't read the book, I should. And I've been doing it since I heard it, right? So it's simple, it's effective, and I heard it through a gem of a podcast, right? And that has obviously driven his book sales, driven Matthew Walker's book sales, driven so many people who've come on his podcast, and podcasts like these, which have humongous distribution channels, right? And 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 to add to your point, you can't sort of sell that on a soundbite, right? If I heard a television sort of interview um, of him talking about his book, or anybody talking about their book, I wouldn't sort of uh, we can swear on this podcast, right?
Well,
Like, I wouldn't have given a shit
sure.
about it, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't have given a shit about it, right? So but since the guy explained the entire thing, and it could be a substitute for the entire book itself, but you would still read it. um, you you were taken through the author's reasoning to write the book, process of writing the book, in terms of how do I structure these chapters, why this chapter is more important than that chapter, what is the most insightful thing I found in this chapter, who are the people I interviewed, who are the most interesting people, what are the quirks of a few people, which sort of builds the entire story, right? You need to know character. um, and then you arrive at like a final piece, and
Yeah.
the entire process is explained into us, and you think that, wow, I would never, I mean, if you were to ask me 3 years ago, would you listen to a would you listen to a 2 hour podcast about a professor talking to you about sleep? Like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's a waste of time. But I've
Yeah,
heard it twice and I couldn't be happier.
that's true. And you definitely needed to listen to that James Nestor episode on breathe, because for the people who don't know, Akash is like a chronic mouth breather.
Yeah,
he
I
needed that.
sorted that out.
Yeah, start taping your mouth when you're sleeping. But another thing is that not just like, you don't just discover people on podcast, you discover ideas, and that has been a huge sort of you know, an advantage to for me, because for example, take the seen and the unseen. Like, I was like I was so much interested in public policy, in economics, because of that podcast, and I even joined uh, a course on like a 4 month or 5 month course on public policy. So that's the amount of influence that a podcast can have. Like, you discover new ideas, and I would say, I would go as far as to say this. It would be one of the best. I think it is one of the best ways for you to discover new ideas. Obviously, there are books and everything, but for the like, in this current world where people like, I think the number of people reading books, it's dropping every day. I think podcasts can be a great, not a replacement, but a great, like a second position when it comes to discovering ideas, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are podcasts you listen to for the people, and you follow these people across platforms, whether it's a particular podcast or a particular book or a particular blog or a particular Twitter thread, right? You follow them across platforms. Certainly, Naval is an example, or what's his name, David Goggins is an example. All these people are examples of people you follow across channels, and there are also ideas you follow across channels, whether it's particular sport, who you want to listen to all these people talking for 2 hours on one topic in one platform, or whether it's a particular political ideology or a philosophy that you want to follow, or a way of living, right? So you can follow all of these things through one form, and through a deep dive from a veteran in that particular industry or that particular field, who has been in that field for years, right? And you really can't get that anywhere else. At least you can't get that ability to switch so quickly, right? Because if you buy a
Hmm.
book, you're very invested in the book, right? And the idea that you will be getting about the topic, whether it's sports or politics or tech or whatever, it's from that one dimensional viewpoint. But with a podcast, you can sort of listen to 15 minutes of this, 15 minutes of that, 15 minutes of this, and you can form your own sort of concoction of whatever it is you want to find. And it's very difficult for you to do that. And even videos, it's a little difficult, because in order to create a video, it is fairly, probably 2 or 3 steps more than it is to create a podcast. Like, just think about how we're doing this right now. We just set up a Zoom meeting, and we're just like talking to each other, right?
Yeah.
um, you can do that on your laptop, you can do that on your phone, you can do that um, anywhere in the world, and it just has to be rendered and just put on wherever we put it on. Right, that's it.
Yeah, so from the creator side, I think it's simple, and we're going to see a boom in the number of podcasts that are going to be out there in the world and even in India. But what I sort of see is from the listener side. I want to understand, or I want to see how more people can embrace this format, because right now it's I mean, the numbers are huge, but I don't think that they're consistent, right? Even us, like, we don't listen to one, like, I don't think there is any podcast that we have listened to, like, every single episode of, like, through like, for its entire episode, like, entire length, right? So that is something that I look forward to see how it's going to pan out, how people embrace, how listeners embrace to the number of shows that are being put out, and with corporate coming in, like Spotify producing shows, Amazon producing shows with big names like Amitabh Bachchan and all these people. I think it's a great way for people to get used to the platform, or even join the format, like, get introduced to that. It's like what people Naval says, when it comes to reading, read what you love until you fall in love with reading. So people can come and
Mm.
listen to those big name podcasts, which might be low on content, but uh, big in its charm to attract the viewers. That can be a sort of leeway to getting into the format, and then people start to discover the other things, the other beautiful things, different ideas, and I think that's one way where people can embrace, and that's why I'm not too uh, against all these uh, big companies producing podcasts. It's like what Netflix is doing with TV shows and movies, right? Like, it's literally dictating the culture. And one trend that recently, like, to give you an example, the show Queen's Gambit. Do you know about that? Like,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
effect it had? Yeah, the just after that show, the number of people who signed up to chess.com, or even Google the word chess or bought chess boards, increased, I think, what, more than 50% in over a decade. So that shows how much power these kind of media has. And yeah, I think these big companies producing podcasts is a good thing, uh, as long as people also start discovering new ideas.
Yeah, I
What do
mean,
you?
like, if for every big company you have, right? For instance, for every, like in India, if you look at YouTube, the biggest Indian YouTube channel, I think, is T Series, right? And that has what, 100, about 90 million subscribers, 90 to 100 million. I might be wrong here, but if you add up the individual, like the top five individual subscribers, you get sort of close to that. You have what, Carrie Minati, who has 21 million. You have Amit Bandana, 20 million. You have a lot of comedians, BB Keywines, all of them, they have about 15 to 20 million. You have
Hmm.
the tech channels, Technical Guruji, um, Geeky Ranjit, and they also have, like, certainly in the high millions. So you have all of these individual players, and I saw a tweet the other day. Individual content creators will eventually gather a bigger following than their corporate or the big name companies, right? So, for instance, ClickBuzz has about 1.5 uh,
Hmm.
million YouTube subscribers, and
Yeah,
Akash
yeah.
Chopra, who is, I mean, he's an Indian commentator and the main thing is he's able to garner audiences in both English and Hindi, and he obviously has cricket acumen that people respect, being a former cricketer himself. And because of that, he has what, 2 million plus subscribers, more than CrickBuzz, and it obviously doesn't put out as much content as CrickBuzz does, both in terms of their YouTube channel, in terms of their website, and their live updates and matches, and their Twitter account as well. So individual content creators are certainly have been given the tools that they didn't have before, whether it's a camera, a computer, um, or a mic, and more importantly, their audiences have been given tools to access them easily, right? And it doesn't have to be a TV with a set-top box, right? It's a
Mm.
phone with an internet connection, and that is pretty widespread in throughout the world, and certainly has been in India with certainly one of the cheapest uh, internet fees in the world, and I think that has sort of given individual content a significant boost, and that is playing out more so in the podcast and YouTube world. We've seen it in the YouTube world for about a decade or so, but in the podcast world, we're seeing that catch up over the past 3 or 4 years.
Mm. So I think it is a pretty hopeful period for podcasts, and I certainly am very bullish on podcasts being, a very quality-driven format. And I really am excited to see where, first of all, our podcast goes, and in general, the format goes in the future.
Yeah, we'll be tugging on the coattails of the larger podcast industry, as everybody is. But hopefully, we can give you, the listener out there, something that is worth listening into.
Yeah. So I think we have talked quite a bit already.
Yeah, I think the people
So
are sick and tired of this now.
so okay, which would you suggest, like for the uninitiated when it comes to podcasts? What shows or what episode would you suggest? Your top three.
Top three, I think for everybody, you should probably just check out, even if you haven't heard of him. The Joe Rogan Experience is something that I think we both would recommend, because
Yeah,
it's just
definitely.
like the caption of that could be "Curious Guy Talks to Everybody," right? For hours, and very few people do that. That's amazing. And in terms of the in Indian podcast with a lot of information, obviously IVM podcast has a whole spectrum of several podcasts under their realm. What I'm listening to right now is, because I don't know the language, which is Kannada. I'm listening to the Taleharte podcast, which is, I can't understand it obviously because it's in Kannada, but hopefully it'll push me to understand it because it's very interesting, regardless of the language it's in. And that's another thing, right? There are so many podcasts in so many different languages, and India is really jumping on that strain because just the number of languages that can be not just democratized but monetized is so high in India, right? And there's an audience to be made. If you literally take someone else's content into another language, you can make a significant following, right? So
Yeah, and
yeah,
there
there's
are
language.
there are a lot
Yeah,
of
go ahead.
languages in India for you to be leveraging. So there is no, there is a lot of room for
There's
everybody to
always a
cover.
market.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
there's just
Yeah,
like I mean, you can literally, if you have a language which does not have content creators, and you have um, tools to create content, whether it's video or audio, you can, and you have users of, or listeners, whether that's listeners, readers, viewers, then you can just simply pick something that you're interested in, whether it's tech or gadgets or politics or anything of that sort, right? And you can immediately create content on that just by addressing that language market that you're in, whatever it may be, right? So that is number two. And I think the Tim Ferriss podcast is obviously a go-to because you discover a lot of people on there, and you never really know so many people who've been all throughout, in several sort of domains, are on the podcast or have been on the podcast 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and that's a clear grab for me. What about you?
yeah. I think Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, they're definitely up there. Although we don't listen to every single episode that's out there, I really wish I could. Like, I really wish I'd be driving so much that I get to listen to all those things. But during this time, you're always at home, and that's no
Or cycling
excuse
with
for.
your headphones.
Yeah, but that's no excuse
But
for
that's
you to not
dangerous.
listen to podcasts. Just because you're staying at home, that doesn't mean you don't listen to it. Instead of Netflix, why don't you just uh, put on Spotify and listen to one of the episodes? I mean, that's what I do sometimes. But yeah, in terms of the episodes, I think yeah, Indian podcast for me, my number one would be The Seen and the Unseen. Just the quality of uh, the guests that Amit Verma brings on and the quality of the conversation, it's amazing. And one thing that we
And we
don't
met
talk
him. We
about, oh
met
yeah,
him.
we
I mean,
did
like
we did.
quite briefly for about 2 minutes, but we did.
Yeah, I think we were the first ones to get a selfie with him, which he was very surprised about. Yeah, like I think that's going to be another trend that we'll start seeing. People getting pictures with podcast host,
So that's
or
another thing we didn't touch upon, right? Like, so with a podcast, the other difference in the creation of content is it's just voice, right? And
yes,
usually you have voice, you always tie voice to a kind of face, right? And with podcasts you don't really tie the voice to a particular kind of face, because you can have a misrepresentation, because you might think a particular person's voice is really rough and coarse, and you might expect him to be this sort of big guy or something like that, right? And you sort of look at him and like, this is not what I imagined. And that happens a lot, right? Especially if you listen to like a new podcast and you keep listening to the host, and you can't really place his or her voice in your head, and then you look at his or her photo and you're like, that's not what I thought. You definitely can't do this with any other form of content,
seems like you've
right?
been
Because
doing it
if
for
you
a lot of people,
yeah,
Akash.
because
What do you
like when you
reckon?
read someone's if you read someone's piece, right, like in print media or digital media, right, you read it in your own voice in your head. It's not like they're reciting it to you. And even if they have like an audio version of it, it's probably an automated voice. And a video, you obviously can see the guy's face, see the girl's face, and there's no misconnection between voice and face. But with audio, and it's just audio, there's obviously a mismatch. At least like that's what's happening with me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely happening with you. I can assure you, listeners, that it is happening with Akash, where his voice may seem very good, but when you look at his picture, I think you would not want to listen to our podcast. So we'll make sure that we don't put out Akash's
Yeah,
photo
man,
anywhere.
that's not at all.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of the podcast host being influencers, yeah, that is another trend we will be seeing soon. It's already happening, uh, but soon it'll happen in a much larger way and in much grander way. And let's hope people also come up to us and take pictures. Obviously, we're kidding. We're not doing it for fame. We're just doing it for our
Because we have
intellectual
nothing better to do,
curiosity.
right?
Yeah. So I think we have covered quite a bit, although we didn't cover. There are a lot of things we haven't covered, but that's for another day, I guess. So how should we end this? Okay, we'll end this by saying that uh, podcast is a great format for anybody who's looking to get some knowledge on ideas, people, everything. As from a listener point of view, it is a great platform for you to discover people. From a creator's point of view, this is just getting started, and we are also getting in this space. So I think it's gonna boom from now on. So remember the date, 22nd December 2020, the day we are recording it. You might see an exponential rise in people listening to podcasts because we are finally here. Do you think that's a great way to end this?
Yeah, man, that's a wrap.
All right, then. We'll see you when we see you, I guess.